Well, hello everybody. It's Bill McKibben coming to you from Addison County. I wish I was there in Montpelier. I've been looking forward to this trip. But obviously, as the great poet James Russell Lowell put it once, new occasions teach new duties. And truthfully, on all kinds of grounds, there's something to be said for learning to communicate via these low carbon digital means. So I'm very grateful to Bob for doing this work today to allow me to be with you virtually. I'm recording this a few days ahead of time, so I don't know precisely where we are in the case in the course of the coronavirus outbreak, but of course, that's first and foremost in our minds. And in fact, that's where I'm going to begin talking. There are some powerful overlaps and lessons that I think it makes great sense to bear in mind as we deal with this crisis, the coronavirus crisis, inside the larger crisis now really ongoing of climate catastrophe, which doesn't pause, of course, simply because we're experiencing pandemic. This week I've just gotten news from colleagues in Australia that we've seen the third great bleaching of the Great Barrier Reef, probably the biggest yet in the last few days. News like that's a heartbreaking backdrop to what we're going through. Let's say a few things about coronavirus. The first is that it's a powerful reminder that, not to put too fine a point on it, reality is real. In the world in which we live, dominated by screens, often divorced from the natural world, it's easy sometimes for people to forget precisely how physical the world remains. But coronavirus is a deep reminder that you can't negotiate with a microbe, that biology is setting the limits here, that we have to respect those limits. It doesn't do any good to say we want to go back to church or the economy is getting hurt or on and on and on. Reality is, in this case, reality is what the microbe says it is, and our job is to respond to it. As with biology, so with physics and chemistry, most of my work for the last 30 years has been around the project of trying to make people understand that physics and chemistry are real, that there's no way to negotiate with a molecule any more than there is with a microbe. And so it's probably a useful reminder, no one would ever wish this kind of pandemic on anyone. As long as we're going to go through it, we might as well learn some things from it, and that would be thing number one. Thing number two would be timing is everything. Let's think about coronavirus again. The US and South Korea recorded their first cases of coronavirus in late January, one day apart. The South Koreans went immediately to work, starting to test everybody, closing down big gatherings, on and on and on. Because they were realistic about what was coming, they were able to flatten the curve, as we now say, fairly quickly. And they're now not done with the virus, but they're definitely looking at the pandemic in the rearview mirror. The US, of course, didn't make those decisions. Our president alternated between saying it was a hoax, or that a miracle would cause it to disappear, that it would go from 15 people down to nothing, that when the weather warmed, we would think everything would be fine, on and on and on. So we allowed it to spread for a month or two. And at this point, now that we're doing the things we could have done months ago, the outbreak is enormous. The death total will be huge. The disruption and the expense is almost beyond, well, certainly beyond compare with anything in my lifetime. That lesson applies dramatically to climate change. We had a strong warning from scientists about what to do about 30 years ago. I wrote the first book about global warming 31 years ago in 1989. That's about when we found out about this. Had we acted then, there were things we could have done that were relatively modest and undisruptive in nature, and they would have flattened the carbon curve. We wouldn't be done dealing with global warming, but we'd be close. And the things that we would have done would have been minimally disruptive. A modest tax on carbon 30 years ago would have steered the super tanker that is our economy in a new direction. But we didn't do that, largely at the behest of the oil companies. We just kept going straight ahead in the direction we were going. Indeed, we speeded up. We've emitted more carbon since 1990 than in all of the years before. And so now we end up in a situation where A, we have to take hugely disruptive measures, and B, even as we take them, they won't be enough to prevent enormous damage. But better late than never, both with the pandemic and with the carbon crisis. It's another reminder that we need to be dealing proactively and profoundly with this. And we should be using the contingencies forced on us by coronavirus to be making kind of down payment on that climate work. The bailouts and relief bills that we're doing shouldn't be designed to bail out cruise ships and oil companies intact. They should be designed to make them change, because we're very clear that if we keep doing what we're doing, we will end up in another even deeper disaster of public health and of everything else as the climate crisis accelerates. Just to remind you of its reality, I'm going to show you a few pictures I took from a trip that I organized to Greenland 18 months ago or so. The first couple just show you what Greenland looks like, that vast, deep sheet of ice, in many places a mile thick, some places thicker than that. Greenland is the biggest island in the world, and in our hemisphere, the biggest storehouse of ice. Enough ice there that when it all melts, the sea will go up some 20 feet just from Greenland, never mind the Antarctic. So when you look at those first two slides, you get a sense of how beautiful it is, and it really is. But you also, here I'll show you one of the ice caves that we wandered inside up on the glacial plateau. You also get the sense that it's melting very fast. This odd picture is from behind the captain's wheel on the boat that I chartered for this expedition that we were organizing. I don't know if you can completely make it out. Through the front window, you can see that there's water in all directions for as far as the eye can see, but I was standing behind the captain's wheel looking up at the electronic chart, and you can see that the dark cursor that marks the place where the boat is a mile onto solid land. Now, I asked the captain about that with some mild trepidation, and he just smiled in a Greenlandic way and said, "Oh, don't worry. That's because everything around here, the chart's 5 years old, and 5 years ago, everything around here was ice as far as you could see, and now it's all melted." I was there because I wanted to get these two women up onto the ice sheet. They're both poets. The woman on the left in the grass skirt is named Kathy Jetnil Kajiner. She comes from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. The Marshall Islands is a place where people have lived quite happily, thank you, for thousands of years. The 20th century did not go great for the Marshall Islands because we exploded a large bomb there on Bikini Atoll, and much of that part of the archipelago is still uninhabitable. The 21st century is going worse for them. The highest point in the Marshall Islands is a meter above sea level. That's a very, very precarious place to be on a rapidly warming planet. So that's been the subject of much of Kathy's poetry, and I wanted her to deliver one of these poems, standing on the ice, that when it melts will drown her home. I figured that would give it extra resonance, and she recruited the other young woman, Aka Niviana. She's a Greenlandic native, and she is watching her homeland disappear beneath her feet. Um, as you as, as you can see in this next picture, the filming was uh, uh, well, we were a long ways out in remote country, but we got it done, and their poem is remarkable. It's been viewed millions of times on wherever you do those viewings, on Facebook and YouTube and so on. It's a poem with a certain amount of rage, but also a fair degree of generosity, at least insofar as it understands that it won't be long before all of us are in this boat. And maybe Bob can show that little video that I shot here now. It's just taken with a cell phone out of the front seat of a helicopter as we flew away after changing the batteries in one of the instruments that scientists use to mark the recession of the glaciers. And it doesn't get to the good part for a minute, so I'll just keep talking. The way to understand climate change is that it's by far the biggest thing that human beings have ever done. The extra carbon that we've put into the atmosphere by burning coal and oil and gas traps every day the heat equivalent of about 400,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. And that's enough to do extraordinary damage. That's enough to melt half the sea ice in the summer Arctic. It's enough to have dramatically altered the chemistry of the oceans so that their pH has shifted in dangerous ways. That's enough to have upended the hydrological cycle of the planet so that we see both more drought and more flood. Now, the tongue of this glacier was about 120 feet high, so a 12-story building. And that piece on the end there began to go just as we were flying overhead. 12-story building. I don't know, maybe there's something in Montpelier that's 12 stories high. There's nothing in Middlebury. But it's a big piece of ice, and those waves are 50, 60, 70 feet. The pilot understandably wanted to leave, but I encouraged him to circle a couple of times, in part because there was an extraordinary, sinister, but undeniable beauty to this. We live on a unbelievably beautiful earth, even in its convulsions. It is a very beautiful place. But mostly, I just wanted to be reminded, and I want to remind you, the fact that this is happening now every second of every minute of every hour of every day, someplace on Earth. Each time one of those chunks of ice crashes into the sea, the ocean goes up some tiny fraction of a millimeter, and the world changes. This is the biggest thing that humans have ever done. I'm not going to show you more slides. I'm just going to talk for a few more minutes about what we still can do. Because though we've wasted an enormous amount of time, and though the easy answers are gone, there are things that are happening that should give us heart and point us in the direction of really effective action. As badly as the politicians have done their jobs, that's how well the engineers have done theirs. The price of a solar panel or a wind turbine has dropped 90% in the last decade. That's very, very, very good news. It means that we know what to replace coal and gas and oil with, and it means that if we wanted to move at speed, then we could. And by the way, coronavirus is showing us what moving at speed looks like. It's sort of amazing after all these years of being told that there's no money to do things like solar energy, to watch us come up with trillions of dollars in the course of a few days. The existence of low-cost renewable energy is an enormous gift. But if we simply leave it to kind of economic forces to deploy all that renewable power. It'll get done. It'll just get done much too slowly. We'll never catch up to the physics of climate change. Yes, 75 years from now, we're going to run this planet on sun and wind because sun and wind are close to free. But if we wait decades to make that transition, then the world that we run on sun and wind will be basically a broken world. So our job is to figure out how to speed up that transition. You would think that if we faced an enormous crisis and had an effective solution, not to the whole thing, there are also things we need to do around agriculture and around lots of other parts of our life, but energy is fundamental here. You would think that having a solution to at least that part of this crisis, we'd be hard at work on it. And we're seeing some change, but not, as I say, at necessary speed. The reason for that, I'm afraid, is that there's a countervailing force here, more powerful than the kind of logic of our situation so far. And that force is the power of the fossil fuel industry, one of the richest industries on Earth, and an industry that we now understand knew everything there was to know about climate change 30 some years ago. Great investigative reporting makes it clear that they, well, a company like Exxon, the biggest company on Earth in the 1980s, had a great scientific staff, and its product was carbon. Of course, they wanted to understand what was happening, and they did. Their scientists made spot-on estimates of how much it would warm and how fast. If you go back and look at the graphs they produced, which people have discovered in secret archives and things, they show that they knew just what the temperature and the CO2 concentration would be in 2020. Those predictions were believed within these companies. Exxon started building all its drilling rigs to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was on the way. But of course, what they didn't do was tell the rest of us. Instead, all these companies together embarked on an enormous and expensive campaign of denial and obfuscation and delay. They built this architecture of disinformation. It kept us locked for 3 decades in a totally phony debate about whether or not global warming was real, a debate that both sides knew the answer to when the debate began. It's just one side was willing to lie, and it turns out it may be the most consequential lie in human history because it cost us those 3 decades. And so we have to figure out how to stand up to that enormous combination, concentration of power and influence. We can't do it by outspending the fossil fuel industry. They simply have too much money. But we can do it by building movements. That's what history indicates. That sometimes people can come together in large enough numbers and with enough creativity and passion that the small and the many can stand up to the mighty and the few. It doesn't need to be everybody or even 50% of people. Apathy cuts both ways. So if you can get 4 or 5% of people really engaged in this fight and out in the streets and demanding action, then, well, then we'd have a pretty good chance. And we're getting closer. This movement's been building for a decade. Much of it began in Vermont with the first big American climate action, which was the March Across Western Vermont in 2006, that led to the creation of 350.org over here in Addison County, which became the first big global grassroots climate campaign. And in the last few years, with such pleasure, we've seen so many others join in. Extinction Rebellion, the Sunrise Movement, which brings us the Green New Deal, and of course, the youth climate strikers around the world. People know about Greta Tunberg, and that's great because Greta's wonderful, and thank heaven she appears to be recovering from the coronavirus. I've talked with her and her father, who's still ill, but on the mend. But there are 10,000 Gretas all over the world, young people who are really, really in the lead here and doing remarkable work, which is great. It's not okay, however, for the rest of us to offload the biggest problem that the world ever faced onto the shoulders of high school sophomores. We need to do this work, and I'm going to suggest a couple of ways that we can make it happen. I'm not going to go into great detail about what's going on in Montpelier right now over various global warming rules. I think that everyone knows that we need to do more, and looks like maybe this year the legislature is laying out some ideas that may at least get us going, but probably not fast enough. This doesn't seem to have become the priority that it has to be for enough of our leaders, but at least we're starting to get somewhere, and I'm grateful to all the work around Efficiency Vermont and going to thermal energy as well as electricity and so on and so forth, the work on electric vehicles. It's all good and important. I want to talk about the big global campaigns that are really starting to bite now and have an effect. Some of you know we started a campaign around fossil fuel divestment now 8 years ago, I guess. And when we started it, the we in this case was sort of myself and Naomi Klein, who cooked up the idea based on work that had happened when we were in college around apartheid in South Africa. And so we wanted people taking on these big fossil fuel companies. We didn't know how well this approach would work. It's worked better than we dared hope. It's become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at $12 trillion now in endowments and portfolios that have divested in part or in whole from fossil fuel. That's very good news because it's had tremendous effect, not only in focusing a light on these issues, but in making it difficult for these companies to raise the capital they need to keep expanding. Shell Oil last year, in its annual report, said that divestment had become a material risk to its business. And that's good because Shell Oil's business is a material risk to life on the planet. 2 weeks ago, the National Mining Association, the big coal lobby in this country, when it was petitioning Congress for its bailout money, its letters said divestment had spread so far and wide that it could no longer find investment capital on its own to open up new coal mines or new coal-fired power plants. So many thanks to all who have helped and to all the Vermont institutions, including Middlebury College, where I work, that have divested. And shame on those who haven't. One of the things that really makes me not just sad, but as close to mad as I allow myself to get is the fact that Vermont's pension fund and the University of Vermont endowment both remain invested in fossil fuel. Our treasurer has clung to one outdated report about the idea that it would cost some money to do the right thing here. The irony is that had she acted when we all asked her to, she would have saved huge amounts of money for the state because the fossil fuel industry has fared worse than any other part of our economy. Literally anything else you invested in over the last 10 years, you would have done better. We don't have exact numbers for Vermont, but we know that across the line in New York, the failure to divest has cost the state pension fund at least $19,000 per pensioner. So you have some sense of what the tragic financial loss we've suffered in Vermont, as well as the moral loss that comes with supporting these companies year after year after year, even as they endanger the planet. So, since all of you up in Montpelier are close to the levers of power, please try to get the legislature and the treasurer to do the right thing. And please try to get the governor and the legislature to appoint people to the UVM trustees who will do the right thing. It would make a big, big difference. This divestment work is now expanded to include the financial institutions that provide the kind of lifeline the pipeline of money that keeps the fossil fuel industry going. In fact, we're calling this new effort stopthemoneypipeline.com. And it's taking on a series of targets: BlackRock, the big asset manager; Liberty Mutual, the insurer; maybe above all, JP Morgan Chase, the biggest bank in the world and by far the biggest funder of the fossil fuel industry. JP Morgan Chase has lent more than $250 billion to the fossil fuel industry just in the years since we signed the Paris Climate Accord. They've done everything they can think of to undermine that accord by providing the money that allows people to go on breaking the planet. And so people are figuring out how to stand up to these guys in serious ways. We had all kinds of things planned for Earth Day that I was going to recruit you all for, but now we're not doing them live and in person for obvious reasons. We're doing things online. If you go to stopthemoneypipeline.com, you can get all the updates. But suffice it to say, if you do business with Chase, or for that matter, Citi or Wells Fargo or Bank of America, the three other biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry, we'd be grateful if you'd figure out how to switch your accounts to someplace else, to a local credit union, to one of the banks on the web like Aspiration Bank or some other local bank that are not taking your money and just immediately reinvesting it in oil and gas companies. If you hold a credit card from Chase, and if you have a United credit card or an Amazon credit card that comes from Chase, then we'd be grateful if you'd cut it up. Don't do it this month if you have no other credit card and no way to pay for things. We're in a place where we need credit cards right now instead of cash if we have them, for obvious reasons. But if you can, this will be a powerful thing to do, especially if we all do it together. April 23rd is the day that we're all aiming for, the day after Earth Day plus 50. That's kind of an update from where we are in the movement right now. Obviously, things are slowed down some by coronavirus, but perhaps speeded up some by it too, because of the realizations that we're starting to come to about the world that we live in. I'm very hopeful that those realizations are sinking in. I know that all of you are already on board, but now we need you thinking of creative ways to make your voices heard. And as I say, a tremendous place to begin would be by divesting Vermont, which would be the least we could, the very least. Think of the changes that people around the world are having to make to deal with climate change already. This is on the easiest possible end of the scale. So we should just do it and get it done so we can go on to other things. I wish I could tell you that if we do all these things, we're going to win this fight. We don't know for sure. The physical momentum now of climate change is enormous. It has that same kind of momentum that the virus took on when we didn't address it early on. But the virus will eventually, we're told, burn itself out. Enough of us will acquire immunity. There'll be a vaccine. That's not going to happen with climate change. The only way to put it out is to stop pushing carbon into the atmosphere and start with good agriculture and other ways of drawing some of it out. So that's the path before us now. I don't know that we can win, but I do want you to know that all over the world you have brothers and sisters who are working with enormous power on this. Every country in the world, every corner of the world. It's always a great honor to be with them, and it's a great honor to be with you, and just say such thanks to the people of Vermont. We don't know how it'll come out, but we do know there's going to be a fight, and it's a great privilege to get to be in that fight with you all. Thank you very much.